Hello, students. Welcome to part 3 of Unit 2. The third video in each unit is called Modern English. In the third video for each unit, we talk about how we can use the language from the unit that we're doing in modern times, in modern English conversation. So just to remind you, the word modern means happening nowadays. So in this video, let's go ahead and talk about what language we can use in modern English conversation. We are in Unit 2, which is called Out of the Past. So to begin today's lesson, I am going to show you some sentences about different people, and I want you to see if you can guess which person I'm talking about. Let's begin. Okay, number 1. So I'm going to show you 3 sentences about the same person. See if you can guess who the first person is. He was a famous painter and inventor. What famous painters and inventors do you know? He lived in Italy in the 15th century. Okay, so a painter and inventor from Italy in the 15th century. Can you guess who it is yet? Maybe this next tip will help you. He painted the Mona Lisa. Did you figure it out? Our first famous historical person is Leonardo da Vinci. Let's go to example number 2. Number 2. Let's look at our next 3 sentences and see if you can guess who this famous historical person is. He was a famous Chinese philosopher. So maybe you can think of a few famous Chinese philosophers. He was born in modern Shandong province in 551 BC. Okay, so he was born a very long time ago. He's a very old Chinese philosopher. And he is one of the most influential thinkers in history. His ideas have really changed the world. Did you guess who this famous historical person is? This famous influential Chinese philosopher is Confucius. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Okay, let's go on to number 3. Let's see if you can guess who this famous historical person is. She was a famous scientist from Poland. Okay, famous scientist from Poland. She was a professor at the University of Paris. Oh, maybe a little hard. Do you know any famous scientists from Poland that also lived in France? Maybe this next tip will give it away. She is the only person to win the Nobel Prize in 2 scientific fields. So this famous historical person won a Nobel Prize in physics and won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Now did you figure out who it is? It's Marie Curie. Leonardo da Vinci, Confucius, and Marie Curie. What do all these people have in common? All of these people are very famous people from the past. In today's video, let's learn how to talk about lives in the past. Today we're going to learn how to talk about people and events that happened in the past. Let's begin by answering this question. What kind of information do we share when we discuss famous people from history? So if I wanted to tell you about a famous person from history, what kind of things would I tell you about? Let's look at 5 common things we talk about when we talk to other people about famous people from history. Well, first, of course, we might tell them where they're from. For example, Marie Curie was from Poland. We might want to say when they were born and when they died. So how long did they live for and when did they live? We might want to talk about what their life was like. So what did they do in their life? What was their life like? What happened during their life? Next, when we're talking about people in history, it can be very important to talk about what the world was like when they were alive. Especially if we're talking about people a very long time ago, it can be helpful to explain what was happening in the world at that time, because that can really affect why someone did the things that they did or thought the things that they thought. And finally, if we're talking about a famous person from history, of course we might want to include why they are famous. So now let's go through each of these 5 key points and learn how to talk about them in English. The first thing we can use if we want to talk about a famous person from the past is where they're from. Let's look at the examples from the beginning of this video to see some different ways we can explain where a famous person from the past was from. First, let's look at Leonardo da Vinci. To explain where he was from, we said, he lived in Italy in the 15th century. For Confucius, we said, he was born in modern Shandong province in 551 BC. And for Marie Curie, we said, she was a famous scientist from Poland. These are all excellent ways to introduce where someone is from. So let's look at some sentence starters we can use for this point. Of course, you know, we can say he or she was from. She was from Poland. We can also tell someone where the person was born. For example, in the example with Confucius, we said he was born in Shandong province, or what is today Shandong province. Finally, we can say he or she lived in, like in the Leonardo da Vinci example where we said he lived in Italy in the 15th century. These are some excellent ways to explain where a famous person in history was from. Next, we can talk about when the person was born and when they died. So let's look at a couple ways we can explain to someone when a famous person from the past was born and when they died. So here are 2 sentences that we can use. We can say he or she was born in and died in. Second, we can say he or she lived from to. So let's look at some examples using these sentences. So first, of course, we have King Sejong. So let's use one of these sentences to explain when he lived, when he was born and when he died. So we could say he was born in 1397 and died in 1450. Next, let's take a look at Cleopatra and use our other example sentence. We could say she lived from 59 BC to 30 BC. Remember, BC, the numbers go the other direction, right? So again, to explain when someone was born and when they died, we can use he or she was born in and died in, or he or she lived from to. The next important topic to think about when talking about a famous person from the past is what their life was like. So what does that mean, what their life was like? Well, this could mean answering questions like, What was their childhood like? What was their family like? Or where did they go to school? So let's use Marie Curie as an example to answer this question. What was her life like? First, let's see. We can answer a question about her childhood, the beginning of her life. She was from a poor family in Warsaw, Poland. Life was very difficult for her and her family. How about what was her family like? Marie was one of 5 siblings. Both of her parents were teachers, which is why she studied science from a young age. So here I am talking about her family and giving a little background information about why did she end up becoming a scientist. And number 3, where did she go to school? She went to the University of Paris, where she studied physics, chemistry, and mathematics. There are more questions you can think about when answering what was their life like. But these are the most common things we think about when explaining the life of a famous person. After we know a little bit about what their life was like, we can think a little bigger and talk about what the world was like when this famous person was alive. There are many details that we can include here, so let's again look at 3 of the most common areas of conversation. So first, what was happening in the world? What was the weather like then, if it affects their story? And what were most people like then? So number 1, what was happening in the world? This means, was there a war happening? Were there political changes? Any social problems? What was happening in this person's life in the world? When they walked out the door, what did they see? Number 2, what was the weather like? If their story and why they are famous has something to do with a certain event, you might need to talk about what the weather was like when that event that made them famous happened. So it was Remember the vocabulary from video 1. It was sunny. It was rainy. It was cloudy, snowy. What was the weather like during that event or during that time? And finally, when thinking about the world, we have bigger problems and bigger events happening. And then there are the other people in that time. What were most people like then? Often famous people were different somehow from most people. So we can compare. What were most people like when they were alive? Most people lived in certain places, worked certain jobs, or did certain things. The purpose of this is to give us some context about where this famous person came from and why they acted the way they did and did the things that they decided to do. Last, of course, we should tell someone why the person is famous. So what did they do that made them famous? We know about their history, we know about the world that they lived in and grew up in. So now we need to talk about what did they do that made them famous. Today, as an example, we're going to talk about this man. Do you recognize him? I think maybe not. He is not very well known. We're going to talk about him and something that happened on this boat. So let's use his story. We're going to use his story to learn how to talk about an event that made someone famous. The person we're going to be talking about today, as an example of an event that made someone famous, is Fridtjof Nansen. If you don't know who he is, soon you will find out. Please turn to page 29 in your book and follow along as we listen to and pick apart this example. Let's begin with the first paragraph. First, listen. Then we'll look at the sentences and see what information they include. Let's begin. Fridtjof Nansen was a Norwegian explorer. He wanted to be the first person to reach the North Pole. He set off on the 24th of June, 1893, from Oslo on a ship with 12 men. Okay, what kind of information do we see in this first paragraph? First, we see who he was. So we see he was a Norwegian explorer. Do you know what this word means, Norwegian? Where is someone from if they are Norwegian? If someone is Norwegian, they are from Norway. So in this first sentence, we find out where he was from and what he did. Next, we see what his goal was. Why did he set off on this adventure that he decided to go on? Why is he about to do what we're going to read about? Because he wanted to be the first person to reach the North Pole. We also see how the event begins and when it begins. We see the term here, he set off on. This is a term used in travel and often used when talking about traveling on a boat. When you set off, this means it's when you begin or when your boat leaves. So in our first paragraph, we see who he was and where he was from, what his goal was or why he decided to do this, and how and when the event begins. Now let's listen to paragraph number 2. At first, things went well, but by November, the weather was foggy and icy. The ship moved slowly through the ice for a year. Then Nansen and another man, Johansen, decided to cross the ice on skis. Okay, what information do we see in this second paragraph? We can see here what the weather was like, which is important to this story because they're taking a boat to the North Pole. So if the weather is foggy and icy, then we can see the ship moved slowly, so it caused a problem. So here it's important to talk about the weather. We also see words that we can use to explain the order in which things happened, like at first. And we can also see in this paragraph what happened next, and the word then. So remember, when you're explaining an event, you can use words like at first, then, next, and so on. So in this paragraph, we see how the story begins, at first, and what happened next after the ship moved slowly. Now let's listen to paragraph number 3. The two men left the ship in March 1895, but there were a lot of problems. They couldn't reach the pole and turned south. The weather was warm, so the ice melted and it was difficult to travel. They built a shelter and waited there for 8 months. Okay, what do we see in this paragraph? Here we see what happened next. We see that the writer added details about the event. So they talked about the problems that happened. They couldn't reach the pole. Again, they talk about the weather and how it made it difficult to travel. And then they explain they had to wait in the ice for 8 months. This paragraph is a great example of past simple tense. Let's look at the verbs in this paragraph. Left, were, turned, was, melted, built, waited. When we talk about events in the past, we always use past simple tense. Let's see more of this in our last paragraph. Paragraph number 4. Finally, on the 17th of June, a British explorer found them. They arrived home safely on the 13th of August, 1896. So in this last paragraph, we see how the event ends, and we see that word finally, another sequence word, or a word we use to talk about the order something happened in. And also here again, we see our past simple verbs, found and arrived. Now that we have listened to each part of this story, of this famous event, let's listen to the whole thing. While you listen, please answer these 4 questions. These are on page 29 in your book. So now let's listen to the whole story and answer these questions. You'll see that the questions relate to the paragraph. Questions 1 are about paragraph 1, 2 is about paragraph 2, 3 is about paragraph 3, and 4 is about paragraph 4. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, let's listen. Fridtjof Nansen was a Norwegian explorer. He wanted to be the first person to reach the North Pole. He set off on the 24th of June, 1893, from Oslo on a ship with 12 men. At first, things went well, but by November, the weather was foggy and icy. The ship moved slowly through the ice for a year. Then Nansen and another man, Johansen, decided to cross the ice on skis. The 2 men left the ship in March 1895, but there were a lot of problems. They couldn't reach the pole and turned south. The weather was warm, so the ice melted and it was difficult to travel. They built a shelter and waited there for 8 months. Finally, on the 17th of June, a British explorer found them. They arrived home safely on the 13th of August, 1896. Okay, now that we have listened to the whole story, let's go ahead and check our notes for each paragraph. So first, let's begin with paragraph number 1. Who made the journey? Who is the person that we're talking about? Here, our famous person is Fridtjof Nansen. And when did his journey begin? Here we see he set off on the 24th of June, 1893. Remember, set off means to leave, especially on a boat. Okay, let's go to paragraph 2. What was the first part of the journey like? Here we see, at first, things went well. And how was the weather? The weather was foggy and icy. Let's look at paragraph 3. How did the journey continue? Here it says the 2 men left the ship. They got off of the boat. And were there any problems? Yes, there were a lot of problems. We see the weather was warm, ice melted, and it was difficult to travel. And finally, let's look at paragraph number 4. What was the end of the journey? A British explorer found them and they arrived home in 1896. So this is an excellent example of how to talk about the event that made a person famous. Remember all the important details that were used in this. When answering the question, why is someone famous, you should tell the story of how they became famous. When you tell the story, remember that the story should have a beginning, middle, and an end. Like we saw with Fridtjof Nansen's story, with words like at first, then, and finally. Make sure to include the important details. So, like in his story, weather was very important and it changed what happened. So, we heard those details in the story. Think about what's important in the story about the famous person that you're talking about and include those important details. Okay, everyone, that's it for our video today. Great job. Now you can go check eClass for your assignment. See you next time.